The shack was a vertebra in a spine of sun-bleached rock. It clung to the rise, the only thing for miles that broke the horizon with a straight line. Around it, the graves, not in neat rows, but scattered like seeds thrown to the wind, each marked by a cairn of stones, smooth and dark against the pale, cracked earth. Isolde Bram had built each one. Her husband first, then the child, a mound so small it seemed the wind might steal it in the night. The others were strangers, travelers who had mistaken the desert for a thing that could be crossed. The desert did not suffer fools. It took their water, then their wits, then their breath, and left them for her to find. She was the land's undertaker, the sole mourner in a congregation of heat and silence. The silence was not empty. It was a presence, thick as dust, that settled in her lungs and coated her tongue. It was the weight of the sky, a blue so vast and pale it had no mercy in it. It was the memory of a man's laugh and a child's cry, scoured away until only the shapes of them remained, like fossils in stone. She moved through her days by the rhythm of the sun, rise with the gray light that bled from the east, the air still holding a ghost of cold, tend the stubborn, thorny plants she coaxed from the dry soil, check the snares, sit on the porch as the sun climbed to its apex, a white-hot eye in the heavens, and watch the heat shimmer over the salt flats until the world seemed to be unmaking itself. In the evening, as the sky bruised purple and orange, she would sit again, a cup of bitter tea in her hands, and watch the darkness swallow the world. The graves were her companions. She knew the story of each one, though she had known none of them in life. The prospector with fool's gold still in his pockets. The young couple, their hands clasped in a grip the sun could not break. The lone man with a book of poetry, its pages turned to brittle wafers. She had touched their sun-scorched skin, closed their dust-filled eyes, and piled the stones to keep the coyotes from their bones. Her hands were maps of this life, the skin cracked and calloused, the nails thick and ridged. They were hands that knew the weight of a shovel, the heft of a stone, the final, unyielding stillness of a human body. They had forgotten the softness of a child's hair, the warmth of a husband's neck. They remembered only work and burial. This day was like any other. The sun had hammered the anvil of the sky, and now it was sliding toward the western rim of the world, bleeding color across the dust. Isolde sat on the top step of her porch, her back against the warped wood of the post. The air was beginning to cool, a relief so profound it felt like a sip of water. The silence was deepening, gathering itself for the long rain of the night. Then, a flicker, a distortion in the heat haze at the edge of the visible world. It was not a coyote, not a dust devil. It was too low, too deliberate. She squinted, her eyes accustomed to parsing the subtleties of the horizon. It was a shape, dark and struggling, crawling. She had seen it before. Another soul who had misjudged the distance, who had believed the horizon was a destination. They always came from the east, crawling toward the sunset, thinking the dark line of the rocks meant water, meant life. They did not know it meant only her, and the end. She did not move. There was nothing to do. If they made it, they made it. If they did not, she would walk out in the morning and find where they had fallen. It was the desert's calculus, and she was no longer arrogant enough to interfere. But it kept coming. A slow, agonizing persistence that was different from the frantic, final lunges she had seen before. This was not a scramble. It was a pilgrimage. An inch, then a pause. Another inch. The sun sank lower, casting the world in a fiery, apocalyptic glow. The crawling thing was a silhouette, a broken insect against the inferno. It moved with a rhythm that was almost hypnotic, a painful pulse against the dying day. Isolde found herself leaning forward, her tea forgotten. There was a terrible intimacy in watching this struggle, a violation of the desert's law of dignified, solitary death. The shape was smaller than she'd first thought. not a man. As it drew closer, emerging from the shimmering air, she saw it was a child, a girl. Her limbs were sticks, her movements jerky, uncoordinated with exhaustion. She crawled on hands and knees, her head hanging low, her hair a matted tangle of dust and sun-bleached strands. Isolde felt a cold knot tighten in her belly. A child. The desert did not discriminate, but there was a particular cruelty to this. She stood up, her joints protesting. The movement was involuntary, a ghost of an instinct she thought had been buried with her own daughter. She stood on the edge of the porch, a tall, gaunt figure in the twilight, watching the small life drag itself across the last stretch of cracked earth. The girl did not seem to see the shack. Her eyes were fixed on some point beyond it, or perhaps on nothing at all. She moved by sheer animal will, one knee scraping forward, then a hand, then the other knee. She was close now, at the edge of the hard-packed dirt that surrounded the shack, the place where the wild desert gave way to Isolde's small claim. In one of her hands, she clutched something. A small bag or pouch, made of worn leather, held in a grip so tight her knuckles were white beneath the grime. She reached the bottom step of the porch and collapsed, not with a cry, not with a sigh, but with a sudden folding of her limbs, as if the strings that held her together had all been cut at once. She lay face down, her small body utterly still, one arm outstretched, the hand with the pouch resting on the lowest plank of wood. For a long moment, the only sound was the whisper of the wind. Isolde did not move. She looked down at the child, a piece of flotsam washed up on the shore of her solitude. She saw the cracked, bleeding skin of her feet, the sharp ridge of her spine through the thin, ragged dress. She saw the fine, pale dust that coated her, making her seem less a thing of flesh and blood, and more a sculpture of the desert itself. Then the girl's lips moved. They were split and swollen, caked with dirt. A sound came from them, so faint it was nearly lost in the wind. It was not a word. It was not a plea for water or help. It was a thread of sound, a melody, a song. It was a tune of rising and falling notes, intricate and ancient, a language of pure sound that spoke of things Isolde could not name. It was the song of a dry riverbed dreaming of rain, of a star falling through an endless night. The sound snagged on something deep inside Isolde, a place she had walled off with stones and silence. It was a key turning in a lock rusted shut for years. She went down the steps, her knees cracking. She knelt beside the girl, the smell of dust and sun and exhausted life rising from her. Gently, with a hesitation that felt foreign, she reached out and touched the child's shoulder. The skin was hot, feverish. The singing stopped. The girl's body went limp. Isolde gathered her up. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones and heat. As she lifted her, the small leather pouch fell from the girl's grasp and landed on the step with a soft thud. Isolde carried the child inside, into the cool dimness of the shack. She laid her on her own cot, a narrow bed against the far wall. The girl's breath was a shallow rasp. Her face, beneath the grime, was sharp with angles, her eyelashes thick with dust. Isolde stood over her, her hands hanging uselessly at her sides. The shack, her sanctuary of silence, felt suddenly, terrifyingly, full. She looked from the child's still form to the open door, where the last sliver of the sun was a line of blood on the horizon. Out on the step, the small leather pouch lay where it had fallen. It seemed to her that it pulsed with a faint, dark light of its own. She worked by rote, the old motions returning to her hands as if they had a memory separate from her mind. She fetched the basin, filled it with the precious, slightly brackish water from the barrel. She found a clean rag, one of the few soft things she owned. She began to wash the girl gently, starting with her face. The layers of dirt came away, revealing skin the color of old ivory, stretched taut over fine bones. There were sores on her cheeks from the sun, and her lips were a geography of pain. As Isolde cleaned her arms, she saw the scratches, the gouges, the marks of a desperate passage through thorn and rock. The girl did not stir. She was lost in a depth of exhaustion that was close to death. Isolde worked in the gathering gloom, the only light from the lantern she lit, its yellow glow pushing the shadows into the corners of the single room. The shack was a simple space. The cot, a small table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth for the rare cold nights, and shelves holding her few possessions. Clay jars of dried herbs, a handful of books with broken spines, a tin box that she never opened. It was a place stripped of everything but necessity. Now, the small, still body on the cot was a loud and glaring exception. When the girl was clean, Isolde found an old nightshirt of her own and eased her into it. It swallowed her small frame. She looked like a fledgling bird fallen from a nest, all sharp angles and vulnerability. Isolde brushed the matted hair back from the girl's forehead. The fever was a furnace beneath the skin. She needed water, but she was too far gone to drink. Isolde dipped the corner of the rag in the water and squeezed a few drops onto the girl's cracked lips. They parted slightly, a reflexive, seeking motion. She did it again and again, a patient, rhythmic sacrament. The night deepened. The desert outside came alive with its own secret life. The yip of a distant coyote, the skittering of some small creature across the roof. Sounds Isolde usually found comforting. The familiar heartbeat of her world now seemed sharp, predatory. They were threats to the fragile life breathing in her house. She pulled a chair to the side of the cot and sat. She watched. There was nothing else to do. The girl's breathing was the only sound in the room, a tiny rhythmic anchor in the vast ocean of the night. Sometime in the deepest hours, when the moon was high and the stars were chips of ice in a black sky, the girl began to murmur. The sounds were not words, but fragments of the song she had whispered on the porch. A rising cadence, a falling note, a sound like stones rubbing together under water. It was a language that seemed to coil in the air, to have texture and weight. And as she sang her broken, sleeping song, Isolde felt a change in the room. The air grew thick, heavy. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to lean inward. A cold draft, impossible in the still, enclosed space, slithered across the floor and coiled around her ankles. She looked at the window, a simple square cut in the thick adobe wall. Outside, the moonlight was stark and white on the desert floor, but for a moment she saw a flicker of movement past the glass. A shape, tall and thin, that seemed to be made of the darkness itself. It was there, and then it was gone. She told herself it was a trick of the light, of her own tired eyes. But the feeling remained. A sense of being watched. A sense of a presence drawn by the girl's unconscious song. The graves outside, her silent, respectful companions, suddenly felt different. They were not resting. They were listening. Isolde felt a tremor of a fear she had not known for years. It was not the fear of loneliness or of death. It was the fear of the unknown, of a power that did not obey the simple, brutal laws of the sun and the sand. She looked at the girl, this small vessel of fever and song, and wondered what she had brought to her door. What was she fleeing? And what was following her? The first gray light of dawn found her still in the chair, her body stiff, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. The girl's fever had not broken. Her skin was still dry and hot, her breathing still a shallow whisper. Isolde knew that if the fever did not break soon, the girl would follow the path of so many others, out into the silence and the stones. She stood and stretched, her bones groaning. She needed to check her snares, to perform the rituals of her survival. But she could not bring herself to leave the shack. She felt a fierce, primal need to stand guard, to shield this small flame from the vast emptiness that waited to extinguish it. She went to the door and looked out. The desert was washed in the soft, neutral light of early morning. The world looked new, innocent. The graves were just piles of stone again. The feeling of being watched had receded with the darkness, but she knew it had been real. She stepped onto the porch. The small leather pouch was still there, on the bottom step. She bent and picked it up. The leather was old, worn to a soft, supple texture, but incredibly strong. It was tied shut with a leather thong. It was heavier than it looked. She held it in her palm, the weight of it solid, real. It felt warm, as if it held a spark of the girl's own fever. She hesitated, her fingers on the knot. It felt like a violation to open it. It was the one thing the child had carried, the one thing she had held onto through her ordeal. It was her only possession, her only story. But the fear from the night, the memory of the shape at the window pushed her on. She needed to understand. She worked the knot loose. It was tied with a strange, intricate pattern she did not recognize. Inside the pouch was not gold, not jewels, not anything a person would crawl through a desert to protect. It was clay, a fine, dry powder of a deep and vibrant red, the color of arterial blood. It smelled of the earth, but a different earth from the pale, alkaline dust of this place. It smelled of ancient, wet things, of deep roots and iron. As she held the open pouch, a gust of wind, sudden and unseasonable, swept across the porch. It swirled around her, lifting the hem of her dress, whispering in her ears with a sound that was almost a voice. A few grains of the red powder lifted from the pouch and danced in the air, catching the morning light like tiny embers. They drifted from the porch and settled on the nearest grave, the one belonging to her husband. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, Isolde saw it. A faint shimmer in the air above the cairn, like the heat haze of midday, but this was the cool of the morning. A single small desert flower, a species that bloomed only after the rarest of rains, pushed its way through the packed earth at the base of the stones. It unfurled its petals, a vibrant, impossible purple against the gray-brown dirt. It had not rained in a year. Isolde stared, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She looked from the impossible flower to the pouch of red clay in her hand. This was not just earth. This was something else. A power. A magic. The kind of thing that got people killed. The kind of thing that drew shadows out of the night. She quickly pulled the thong tight, closing the pouch. She looked back at the still form on her cot. The girl was not just a lost child. She was a carrier of something potent, something the desert itself responded to. And whatever she was carrying, whatever she was, something was hunting her for it. The knowledge settled in Isolde not with a sense of wonder, but with a deep, aching dread. She had invited a storm into her house, and the sky was already darkening. Days bled into one another, measured by the rising and falling of the girl's fever. Isolde moved in a fog of exhaustion. Her world shrunk to the confines of the shack, to the small, hot body on the cot. She forced water between the girl's lips, bathed her forehead with cool cloths, and listened to the fragmented sleeping songs that coiled in the air. The world outside the shack had changed. The silence was no longer passive. It was active, listening. The wind that scraped against the walls seemed to shape itself into whispers. At twilight, she would see them again, the flickers of movement at the edge of her vision, the tall, thin shapes that seemed to be woven from the fabric of the dusk. They never came closer than the perimeter of the graves, held at bay by some unseen boundary. But they were there, waiting, patient as stones. The girl would sometimes thrash in her fever dreams, her small hands clenching, her legs kicking as if she were still running. In those moments, words would bubble up with the song fragments. They were sharp, guttural sounds, a language of thorn and rock. Isolde did not understand them, but she understood the terror that fueled them. During one of these fits, the girl's eyes flew open. They were not the unfocused eyes of delirium. They were clear, lucid, and filled with an ancient, bottomless fear. They stared right at Isolde. A single word escaped her lips, sharp and clear. Cot. Then her eyes rolled back, and she sank again into the fever. The word hung in the air, sharp as a shard of obsidian. It felt like a name. Not the girl's name, but the name of what she feared. The name of the shadows that waited outside. Isolde began to talk to the girl. She did not know if she was heard, but the silence in the shack had become unbearable. She told her about the graves, about the husband with the kind eyes and the calloused hands, about the daughter with hair the color of corn silk. She spoke of the silence and the heat, of the way the stars looked in the deep of winter. She unburdened herself of the stories she had carried alone for years, pouring them into the space around the sick child, building a wall of words against the waiting dark. On the fourth day, the fever broke. It happened not with a dramatic sweat, but with a quiet receding of the heat, like a tide going out. The girl's breathing deepened, becoming even and slow. Her skin, which had been stretched and dry, seemed to soften. Isolde, slumped in her chair, felt the change before she saw it. The oppressive tension in the room eased. She touched the girl's forehead. It was cool. For the first time in days, Isolde felt a sliver of hope. It was a painful, unfamiliar sensation. Later that afternoon, the girl woke up. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the dim light. They were the color of dark honey, and they held a watchfulness, a wariness far beyond her years. She looked at Isolde, then around the small room, taking in the shelves, the hearth, the door. Her gaze was intelligent, assessing. She tried to sit up, her small body trembling with the effort. Isolde moved to help her, propping her up against the pillows. She offered her a cup of water. The girl took it in shaking hands and drank, long and deep. She finished the whole cup, then looked at Isolde, a silent question in her eyes. More, Isolde said, her own voice hoarse. She refilled the cup. The girl drank again. They existed in this silence for a long time. The girl did not speak. She watched Isolde with those old, watchful eyes. Isolde did not press her. She knew that silence was a language too, a language of safety, of assessment. The girl was a wild thing, and she needed to know this small territory was safe. Isolde brought her a bowl of thin broth, made from a snared rabbit. The girl ate slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving Isolde's face. When she was done, she set the bowl aside. Her gaze fell on the table, where Isolde had left the small leather pouch. The girl's expression did not change, but a new intensity entered her eyes. She looked from the pouch to Isolde. Isolde understood. She picked up the pouch and held it out. The girl took it, her fingers closing around the worn leather with a possessiveness that was absolute. She did not open it. She simply held it, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Her eyes closed for a moment, and a long sigh escaped her lips, a sound of profound relief. She had her anchor back, her connection to whatever she was. The next days were a slow, quiet dance of recovery. The girl, who remained nameless, began to regain her strength. She would sit up on the cot, the pouch of clay always in her lap or in her hand. She watched everything Isolde did, from the mending of a shirt to the grinding of herbs. Her silence was not empty, it was absorbent. She was learning Isolde, learning the rhythms of this new, strange place. She began to walk, at first just a few shaky steps inside the shack, then out onto the porch. She would stand there for hours, staring out at the desert, her small face unreadable. She never looked directly at the graves, but Isolde felt she was aware of them, of the stories they held. One afternoon, Isolde was outside, tending to her thorny garden, when she saw the girl crouched by the grave with the impossible purple flower. The flower was still there, a defiant splash of color against the dust. The girl was not touching it. She had the pouch open on the ground beside her, and she had taken a pinch of the red clay. With a single, focused finger, she was drawing in the dirt at the base of the cairn. Isolde walked closer, her footsteps soft on the earth. The girl did not look up, lost in her work. She was drawing a shape, a symbol. It was a spiral, but it was intricate, complex, with smaller spirals branching off it, like a galaxy or a fern. It was a pattern of immense energy, of life unfolding. As she completed the shape, the purple flower seemed to brighten, its color deepening, as if it were drinking light from the air. The girl hummed as she drew, a low, monotonous tune. It was not the sleeping song of her fever. This was a different kind of song, a song of making, a song of will. Isolde watched, a feeling of awe and terror warring within her. This child was not just a refugee. She was a priestess, a shaper, a keeper of some ancient, powerful rite. The red clay was her ink, the earth her parchment, and the spirits of this place, the silent, waiting spirits of the dead, were her audience. The girl finished her drawing. She looked at it for a long moment, then carefully brushed it away with her hand, leaving no trace. She closed the pouch, stood up, and looked at Isolde. For the first time, a flicker of something like a smile touched her lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it changed her whole face, giving Isolde a glimpse of the child beneath the old soul. In that moment, Isolde knew she had crossed a line. It was no longer a matter of simple charity, of giving shelter to a lost traveler. She was now a participant, a guardian. She had chosen to stand by this child, and in doing so, she had chosen to stand against whatever was hunting her. That night, the shadows at the edge of the graves were bolder. They were no longer just flickers. They had substance. She could see them, tall and gaunt, their forms indistinct, as if they were woven from smoke and fear. They did not have faces, but she could feel the intensity of their focus. It was directed at the shack, at the child within. The cot, she thought, the name a cold stone in her gut. They were waiting for something, an invitation, a moment of weakness. She went inside and barred the door, a gesture that felt laughably inadequate. The girl was asleep on the cot, her breathing calm and even, the pouch of clay clutched in her hand. The simple, profound trust in her sleeping face was a weight on Isolde's heart. She had buried a husband and a child. She had thought her heart was a barren, stony piece of ground. But now, a small, strange, and dangerous seed had taken root there, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would defend it with her own life. She would turn her hands, the hands that had only known how to bury, into weapons. She would face the shadows and the silence, and she would not let them have this child. The desert had taken everything from her. It would not take this, too. The girl began to speak, not with words, but with pictures. She would take a stick and draw in the hard-packed earth outside the shack, her small body crouched in concentration. Her drawings were not the simple, charming scrawls of a child. They were complex, layered, and full of a stark, brutal meaning. She drew a world of stone and wind, of towering rock formations that looked like grasping hands. She drew people, tall and thin like the shadows Isolde saw at night, but in the drawings, they had faces, masks of white clay with black, empty holes for eyes and mouths. The cot. She drew them hunting, carrying long, thin spears, their bodies moving with a predatory grace. And she drew a figure, small and running, clutching a pouch. Herself. One day, she drew a woman. She lay on a great flat stone, her belly swollen, her face turned to a sky filled with a spiral of stars. From her body, a red line, the color of the clay, snaked out and connected to the earth. It was a drawing of creation, of a profound and sacred birth. Then, she drew the cot coming, their white masks turning toward the woman on the stone. She drew them, taking something. Not the baby, but something from the earth itself, a darkness they pulled up from the roots of the stone. After that, she drew fire and flight and a long, desperate journey. She drew figures falling and figures standing against the hunters, only to be overwhelmed. The story was a litany of loss, an epic of a people being winnowed down, hunted for the very thing that gave them life. Isolde would watch these silent stories unfold, her heart aching with a grief that was not her own, but which resonated with the hollow places inside her. She was beginning to understand. The girl was not just a keeper of a right. She was the right itself. She was the last vessel of a power the cot both craved and feared. The red clay was not just a tool. It was an inheritance, a legacy of creation passed down through a maternal line, a direct connection to the life force of the earth. The cot, it seemed, were a corrupted branch of the same people, a faction that had chosen a different path, one of control and sterility. They could not create. They could only take. And they were hunting the last spark of creation to either possess it or extinguish it forever. The girl's presence continued to change the land around the shack. It was subtle, but undeniable. The thorny plants in Isolde's garden grew with a new vigor, their leaves a deeper green. Lizards, usually shy, would bask on the porch steps, their heads cocked as if listening. The air itself felt different, charged with a low hum of energy, a vibrancy that pushed back against the oppressive silence of the wider desert. The graves, too, were changing. More impossible flowers appeared, small constellations of color around the cairns. Sometimes, in the quiet of the afternoon, Isolde would hear a sound like humming coming from the stones, a low, resonant vibration that she felt in the soles of her feet. The dead were not resting. They were waking. They were standing guard. The girl seemed to draw strength from this awakening. The fear in her eyes began to be replaced by a quiet resolve. She started to make sounds, imitating the bird calls she heard, the sound of the wind. She was weaving herself into this new place, finding her voice in its language. One evening, as the sun set, she pointed to a hawk circling high overhead. "Suri," she said, her voice clear and soft. It was the first word she had offered, a name for a thing in their shared world. Isolde looked at her, then up at the hawk. "Suri," she repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It felt right. The girl smiled, that rare, fleeting smile that lit her from within. They began to build a language together, a pidgin of the girl's ancient tongue and Isolde's stark English. Suri was hawk, Kesh was the wind, Anya was water. Maya was the name the girl gave to the red clay, a word she spoke with a reverence that was almost prayer. She never offered her own name, and Isolde never asked. She was simply the girl, a presence as fundamental as the rock in the sky. But the hunters were growing more impatient. Their nightly vigil became more menacing. They no longer stayed at the perimeter of the graves. They began to test the boundary. One night, Isolde was jolted awake by a sharp cracking sound. She went to the window. One of the cots stood just feet from the porch, its long, thin form a slash of deeper black against the night. It had thrown a stone against the wall of the shack. It stood there, its faceless mask turned toward the window, an attitude of pure, malevolent demand. Inside her, a cold rage began to build, a rage she had not felt since she had laid her daughter in the ground. This was her place, her sanctuary. These graves were hers to tend. This child was hers to protect. She would not be terrorized in her own home. The next day, she began her preparations. She did not have guns. Her husband's old rifle had been bartered for supplies years ago. But she had other weapons. She had her knowledge of this place. She had her hands. She began to walk the perimeter of the graves, her eyes to the ground. She was looking for the deep cracks in the earth, the places where the ground was unstable. She found loose rocks, balanced precariously on the edges of small ravines. She knew the paths the coyotes used, the game trails that were invisible to an unfamiliar eye. She began to work. She dug shallow pits and covered them with brittle brush. She loosened stones at the top of the rise, creating small potential rock slides that could be triggered with a single kick. She took the thorny branches of the mesquite and wove them into tangled, hidden barriers. She was not building a fortress. She was setting a snare. She was turning the desert itself into a weapon, using its own subtle dangers against the invaders. The girl watched her, her honey-colored eyes missing nothing. She understood what Isolde was doing. One afternoon, she came to Isolde as she was working, her small face serious. She held out the pouch of Maya. She opened it, and using her own saliva to moisten the clay, she made a thick paste. Then, wordlessly, she began to paint on Isolde's skin. She drew on her arms, her hands, her face. The patterns were intricate, spirals and lines that mirrored the drawings she made in the dirt. The clay was cool on Isolde's skin, and it tingled with a strange energy. As the girl painted, she hummed her song of making, the low, resonant tune that seemed to draw power from the earth. When she was finished, Isolde was covered in the sacred symbols of the girl's people. She looked at her own hands, the calloused, work-worn skin now a canvas for an ancient rite. She felt a strange power settle over her, a connection to the ground beneath her feet. She was no longer just Isolde Brahm, the widow, the undertaker. She was a guardian, marked for battle, anointed by the last priestess of a dying world. That night, the moon was a sliver of bone in the sky. The cot came. There were 3 of them. They moved out of the darkness, not with stealth, but with a new, arrogant confidence. They did not stop at the edge of the graves. They walked between the cairns, their feet silent on the sacred ground. They were coming for the girl. Isolde was waiting on the porch, a heavy, sharpened digging spade in her hands. She was not afraid. The cold rage had burned away all fear, leaving only a hard, clear purpose. The girl was inside, crouched by the hearth, the pouch of Maya open before her. She was not hiding. She was preparing. The 3 hunters stopped at the bottom of the steps. They stood in a line, their white, featureless masks gleaming in the starlight. One of them took a step forward. It raised a hand and pointed a long, thin finger at Isolde, then at the door behind her. The gesture was clear. "Stand aside." Isolde did not move. She held the spade across her body, its sharpened edge glinting. She felt the clay on her skin, cool and alive. She felt the power of the waking graves at her back. "This is my home," she said, her voice low and steady. "The dead who sleep here are under my care. The child in this house is under my protection. You are not welcome here. Turn back." The cot did not seem to understand her words, but they understood her intent. The one in the center tilted its head, a gesture of mocking curiosity. Then, with a sudden, fluid speed, it lunged for the steps. Isolde was ready. She did not swing the spade like a club. She used it as she had always used it, as an extension of her own body. She pivoted, driving the sharpened edge down into the dirt at the base of the step, right where the hunter's foot would land. The creature, expecting a solid surface, put its full weight down. The ground, already loosened by Isolde, gave way. The hunter's leg plunged into the hidden pit, and it went down with a surprised hiss, its body twisting at an unnatural angle. The other 2 paused, momentarily startled. It was all the time Isolde needed. She kicked a rock at the base of the porch post, a rock she had placed there earlier. It was a trigger. Above them, on the rise, a section of the rock face she had painstakingly prepared gave way. A shower of stones and dirt rained down, not a massive landslide, but enough to create chaos and confusion, to separate the 2 remaining hunters. One leaped back, avoiding the falling rock. The other was driven to the side, toward a dense thicket of thorns that Isolde had reinforced. It stumbled into the tangled branches, and its thin, dark clothing snagged and tore. It hissed in frustration, trying to pull itself free. Isolde did not wait. She leaped from the porch, over the flailing form of the first hunter, and ran toward the one tangled in the thorns. It was trying to bring its spear to bear, but the branches hampered its movement. Isolde did not hesitate. She drove the spade forward like a spear, not at the creature's body, but at the ground beneath its feet. The earth was soft there, a patch she had watered for days to turn it into a muddy trap. The hunter's feet sank, and it lost its balance. In that moment, from inside the shack, the girl's voice rose. It was not the whisper of her fever, not the hum of her making. It was a full-throated song, a cry of immense power and wild, untamed energy. It was a song of command. The air crackled, the ground vibrated. The humming from the graves rose to a deafening roar. From the cairns, a pale, shimmering light began to rise, the color of moonlight on water. The spirits of the dead, the prospector, the young couple, her husband, her child, were answering the call. They swirled around the struggling cot, not as terrifying specters, but as a wall of pure, silent presence. They were a barrier of memory, of lives lived and lost on this soil. The third hunter, the one that had leaped back from the rockfall, froze. It looked from the spirits to Isolde, who stood spade in hand, her face a mask of grim determination, the red symbols on her skin glowing with a faint light. It looked at its two companions, one trapped in the earth, the other tangled in thorns, both surrounded by the silent, shimmering dead. It felt a power here it could not fight, a spirit of place that was ancient and unyielding. It had come for a spark of life, but it had found a mountain. With a low hiss, a sound of frustration and dawning fear, the third hunter turned. It backed away slowly, its faceless mask fixed on Isolde. Then it spun and fled, its dark form swallowed by the night. The two trapped hunters struggled for another moment, but the pressure of the spirits was too much. It was not a physical attack, but a psychic one, a weight of sorrow and memory and belonging that they, as sterile takers, could not bear. With cries of rage, they tore themselves free, one leaving a piece of its cloak on the thorns, the other scrambling from the pit, its leg dragging. They fled after their companion, vanishing into the vast, silent dark. The song from the shack softened, the cry of command turning into a lament, then fading into silence. The light from the graves dimmed, the spirits sinking back into the earth, their duty done. The humming ceased. Isolde stood alone in the sudden, profound quiet, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the heavy spade in her hands. The cool night air touched her skin. She was alive. The child was safe. She had held the line. She turned and walked back to the shack, her legs trembling. She opened the door. The girl was standing in the center of the room, her small body radiating a quiet power. The pouch of Maya was on the floor, and around it, she had drawn a circle of red clay. She looked at Isolde, her honey-colored eyes filled with a deep, ancient wisdom. She had called the storm, and Isolde had been her lightning rod. They had faced the darkness together and won. But Isolde knew it was not over. The cot had been repelled, but they had not been defeated. They would return, and the moon was waxing. A blood moon was coming, and with it, the final rite. The days that followed the battle were filled with a new kind of silence. It was not the silence of emptiness, nor the charged silence of waiting. It was a silence of preparation, of gathering strength. The bond between Isolde and the girl deepened, forged now in the shared fire of combat. They moved around each other with an easy grace, their shared language of words and gestures growing more complex. The girl taught Isolde the names of the stars in her own tongue, vast constellations that told the story of her people. Isolde taught the girl how to set a snare, how to find water in the shade of a rock, how to read the signs of the desert. They were no longer just a widow and a refugee. They were a clan of two, a teacher and a student, a mother and a daughter, their roles shifting and blending with the rising and setting of the sun. The girl spent hours with the Maya. She was not just drawing pictures anymore, she was mixing the clay with herbs she gathered under Isolda's guidance, with her own saliva, with morning dew collected from the leaves of the thorny plants. She was creating something, a sacred substance for a purpose Isolde did not yet understand, but which she knew was fast approaching. The moon swelled in the night sky, growing from a sliver of bone to a pregnant silver orb. With its growth, the feeling of pressure on the world returned. Isolde could feel the cot out in the darkness, beyond the range of her vision. They were not gone. They were regrouping, watching, waiting for the moment of the moon's fullness. They knew, as she and the girl knew, that this was when the veil between worlds was thinnest, when power could be seized, when destinies were written or erased. The girl began to prepare the ground. She chose the place. It was not near the shack, but further up the rise, a wide, flat expanse of rock surrounded on three sides by towering stone formations. It was a natural amphitheater, a sacred space. At its center was a single, great, flat-topped boulder, the one she had drawn in her pictures, the altar. For days she worked, clearing the space of loose stones and debris. Then she began to draw. Using a fine powder made from a soft white stone, she drew a massive circle on the ground, and within it, the great, intricate spiral that was the symbol of her people, the map of their cosmology. It was a work of immense scale and precision, her small body moving with a tireless, focused grace. Isolde watched her role now that of a sentry. She patrolled the perimeter, her senses stretched, her body thrumming with a constant, low-level alertness. She refreshed her traps, reinforced her barriers. She was the guardian of the right, the keeper of the sacred space. She felt the clay patterns the girl had painted on her skin as a permanent part of her now, a second skin of power and purpose. The night of the full moon arrived. As the sun sank, it did not paint the sky in bruises of purple and orange, but in a violent, bloody crimson. The light washed over the desert, making the pale earth look like it was soaked in rust. When the moon rose, it was not silver. It was a deep, coppery red, the color of the Maya, the color of a wound in the sky. A blood moon. It hung over the world, vast and ominous, casting an eerie, reddish light on the landscape. It was time. The girl came to Isolde. She was dressed in the clean nightshirt, which now seemed like a simple, white ceremonial robe. Her face was solemn, her honey-colored eyes reflecting the red light of the moon. She carried the pouch of Maya, and in her other hand, a small clay bowl containing the paste she had so carefully prepared. She said nothing. She did not need to. She simply met Isolde's eyes and nodded. Together, they walked up the rise to the ceremonial space. The air was thick, heavy, and unnaturally still. No wind, no sound from the night creatures. The world was holding its breath. In the center of the great white spiral, the girl knelt before the altar stone. She placed the bowl of wet clay upon it. She looked at Isolde, and for the first time, Isolde saw true fear in her eyes, the fear of a child facing an immense and terrifying burden. "Anya, Isolde," she whispered, using her word for water, but her tone gave it a different meaning. "Stay with me. Be my strength." Isolde knelt opposite her, on the other side of the altar stone. She placed her hands flat on the rock. "I am here," she said, her voice a low anchor in the terrifying silence. "I will not leave you." The girl took a deep breath. She closed her eyes and began to sing. It was the first song, the one she had whispered on the porch when she collapsed. But now it was not a broken fragment. It was whole, complete. A song of incredible complexity and power. The notes poured from her, filling the amphitheater, echoing off the surrounding rocks. It was a song of creation, of birth, of the deep, secret life of the earth. As she sang, the Kayat came. They emerged from the shadows between the rocks, a dozen of them, maybe more. They moved into the red moonlight, their white masks looking like skulls, their long spears held ready. They formed a circle around the ceremonial ground, just outside the great white spiral. They did not attack. They stood and watched, their faceless gaze fixed on the child. They were waiting to see if she would fail. If she faltered, they would strike and claim the power for themselves. The girl's voice grew stronger, the song more powerful. She dipped her fingers into the bowl of wet maya. She began to paint on the altar stone, her hands moving in a blur, creating the intricate, spiraling patterns of her people. The red clay seemed to glow in the moonlight, pulsing with a life of its own. The ground began to vibrate. The low hum that Isolde had felt before returned, but 100 times stronger. The rocks around them resonated with the song, the entire desert seeming to join in the chorus. Isolde felt the power surge up through the stone, into her hands, into her body. It was the raw, untamed life force of the world, drawn to the surface by the girl's song and the power of the Maya. The cot grew restless. The power was building to a level that was dangerous to them. A few of them took a step forward, testing the boundary of the white circle. As their feet touched the white powder, it flared with a brilliant light, and they recoiled with hisses of pain, as if burned. The circle was a ward, a line of protection they could not cross as long as the rite was in progress. The girl's song reached a crescendo, her voice soared, a note of pure, piercing power that seemed to shake the stars in the sky. She finished her painting on the stone. It was a map of the heavens, a mirror of the cosmos, all rendered in the living clay. She lifted her clay-covered hands from the stone. Her body was trembling with the effort, sweat beading on her forehead. The song softened, changing from a song of creation to a song of naming. Now came the final, most dangerous part of the rite. She had to claim her power, to give it a name, and in doing so, bind it to herself forever. She looked at Isolde, her eyes wide, asking a silent question. Isolde knew what she had to do. She was the anchor, the witness, the guardian who held the space for this magic to unfold. She poured all of her own strength, her own grief, her own fierce, protective love into her gaze and sent it across the altar to the child. You are not alone. I am with you. The girl turned her gaze inward. The song became a whisper. She was searching for the name, the true name, that was waiting for her in the heart of the power she had summoned. The cot watched, their bodies tense. This was the moment of greatest vulnerability. If she chose the wrong name, or if her will was not strong enough to claim it, the power would be unharnessed, chaotic. It would consume her, and then it would be theirs for the taking. The silence stretched, thick and taut. The only sound was the girl's whispered, questioning song. Isolde felt the spirits of the graves stirring again, not rising, but adding their strength to the ward, their silent presence a wall of protection around the circle. The girl's face was a mask of concentration. Her lips moved, testing sounds, syllables, searching. Then her eyes flew open. They were blazing with light, the honey color burned away by a pure golden fire. She had found it. She stood up, her small body seeming to grow, to take on a terrifying majesty. She raised her hands to the blood-red moon. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a child. It was a voice of immense age and power, a voice that was the earth and the sky and the stars combined. She spoke the name. A single word that was never meant to be spoken aloud, a name that held the power of creation and destruction in its syllables. The word struck the air like lightning. The ground bucked. The red clay on the altar stone flared, burning with the intensity of a sun. A wave of pure power exploded outward from the circle. It was not a destructive force, but a wave of pure life, of unbearable vitality. It washed over the cot. They screamed, a sound of dry leaves burning, of stone cracking. The life force was anathema to them, a poison to their sterile, empty nature. Their dark forms began to unravel, to dissolve, not into dust, but into nothingness. Their white masks the last things to fade, cracking and turning to powder before being swept away by the tide of power. In a moment, they were gone. All of them. Erased. The wave of energy washed over Isolde. It did not harm her. It filled her. It poured into the hollow places, the barren ground of her heart. It was a feeling of rain after a lifetime of drought, of a dawn after an endless night. The grief, the silence, the loss were not washed away, but they were transformed. They became part of a larger pattern, a landscape that could now, finally, bear life again. The light faded, the ground stilled. The girl lowered her arms, the golden fire receding from her eyes, leaving them the color of warm honey once more. She swayed, the immense power having taken its toll. Isolde rushed around the altar and caught her as she fell. She held the small, exhausted body in her arms. The girl looked up at her, a true, weary smile on her lips. She had done it. She had claimed her name, her power. She had ended the hunt forever. Isolde held her close, her face buried in the child's hair, which smelled of dust and clay and starlight. The blood moon hung overhead, its work done. The silence that returned was new. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of peace. A deep, resonant quiet that was full of life, of sleeping spirits, and of a future that had been bought at a great price. Isolde carried the girl back down the rise to the small shack that had become their fortress, their world. She laid her on the cot and sat beside her, watching her sleep, just as she had on that first night. But everything was different. The shack was no longer a tomb for her memories. It was a home. The graves outside were no longer just markers of death. They were a garden of guardians, a silent, watchful family. And she was no longer just Isolde Bram, the widow. She was a guardian, a witness, the mother of a child who carried the bones of prophecy and had named the stars. She looked out the window at the desert, bathed now in the soft, receding light of the copper moon. It was still a harsh and unforgiving land, but it was not empty. It was alive. It was theirs.